Okay.
Let's start.
Good evening, dear colleagues, dear friends, dear audience, dear panel of speakers. Let me start our webinar this evening. It's already a tradition at Levan Mikeladze Foundation to hold discussions on topical issues of Georgia security, timed quite deliberately to coincide with Levan's birthday. This year's discussion comes at a time of real showdown between Russia and the West. There is mounting concern over tens of thousands of Russian troops dug in along the border of Ukraine. But I think this text was more relevant to the couple of days ago, because today those forces are already in Ukraine. They've been approaching Kiev and many other cities, and hundreds of casualties, both killed and injured, are reported. So there's a bloodshed on Ukraine soil, and Russia and NATO have traded with warnings. Each side claims being threatened by the other, but one question is dominant. What will Vladimir Putin do next, and what will follow? There's a problem which I think so painfully is bothering many thousands of people around the world. For Georgia, the answer to this question is of existential significance, Being outside the security umbrella of any kind, Georgia already experienced the punitive power of an embittered Russia in 2008. Therefore, for us, the current phase of confrontation between the West and Russia, with its scale, intensity, justifiably causes concern. So there are plenty of questions rising, and we have to analyze all of them and look for answers, explanations, and so on. This is why we have invited this impressive set of speakers, high qualified, experienced diplomats, to talk about very painful issue. What's going on in the relationship of East and West, Russia and the West? How things are unleashing, and what will take place in coming days. So the main point of our webinar is this, as I have just explained, or I attempted to explain. Dear colleagues, let me firstly present the presenters who will discuss the issue at this webinar. We are waiting for addition, I would say, supporters, and hopefully they will come at times. We will present them, and of course, we'll allow them to address the audience. Now, today we have here Ambassador of the U.S. to Georgia, quite recently. For dynamic times, it's I think correct impression. Honorable John Tefft, let me greet him. I'll present him in more details later. Another presenter from the United States is Mr. Anders Wimbush, our old friend. I hope many of you know him or heard about him a lot. There is Ambassador Archil Gegeshidze with us. He is not only administrative director of this foundation, but formerly he served as a Georgian ambassador to the United States. I'm honored to welcome Mr. Zurab Abashidze, who is really highest level expert on Russian issues here in Georgia. And Mr. Mamuka Tsereteli, who leads American Georgian Business Council and also working in number of American institutions, studying and analyzing situation in this wider region, Black Sea, Caspian, and almost entire post-Soviet space also. You know the rules and procedures. They've been explained in the invitations. So let's start. First, I would like to give the floor to Mr. John Tefft, and ask him to discuss the topic I have presented previously. It's needed to be a couple of words said about him. He's very experienced diplomat. Used to work at the post of American ambassador to Georgia. Nowadays, he's working with the Rand Corporation and having number of other things to do. Let me Just a second. No. I bet my computer not to
კარგად არის ირაკლი.
cause problems. კი,
კი.
აქ თითქოს რაღაც არის თქვენსკენ არის მე მგონი.
არა, დაქოქე ირაკლი, ცოტა თორე ძალიან დიდი დრო გავა.
ხო არა?
კი, ცოტა დაქოქე.
კი, გეთახმებით. ნამდვილად გეთახმებით.
კარგად არის კომპიუტერი. კარგად ჩახარ, ყველაფერი კარგად არის.
John, why don't you start and maybe Irakli will rejoin us. I think he something happened.
Should I go ahead, Archil?
Yes.
Okay. Well, let me just say thank you for inviting me to participate today and to be with this really distinguished panel of experts. Before I say a few words about American policy, I want to just remember my friend Levon Mikaladze. As many of you probably know, Levon was the ambassador of Georgia to the United States when I was nominated to be ambassador to Georgia. And he became not only a good friend, but really a mentor. He and his wonderful wife, Lolly, helped Mariella, my wife, and I really prepare for our assignment to Tbilisi. And we always have such fond memories of him. And I think of his memory today as we honor him and his birthday. The second thing I want to say at the start is we feel this enormous sadness, as I'm sure most of you do too, is about this tragedy that we are seeing in Ukraine. We're just heartsick, Mariella and I, watching the horrible human cost of this naked Russian aggression. And we've been trying to be in touch as much as we can by the internet with our friends and our former colleagues at the embassy there. I have to tell you, over and over this week, the Russian brutality that we've seen really reminds us every day of our time in Georgia in 2008, during the war there, during the Russian invasion, and all of the suffering we saw and felt among the Georgian people. I'm also, I have to tell you, reminded of the 1956 Hungarian Revolution. I served in Budapest early in my career. It was 25 years after the revolution. But I have to tell you, hardly a day went by without someone or something reminding me of the horrible cost of what the Russians did, what the Soviet forces did in 1956. And I suspect that those same long memories will endure in Ukraine for generations based on what's happening today. So let me just turn and use my 5 minutes on the issue that Archil asked me to comment on briefly, and that is the Biden administration approach over the last several months, but particularly during this crisis, during the war that's been launched by Russia inside of Ukraine. I think fundamentally that President Biden and his team have done a pretty artful job of trying to manage this Russian manufactured crisis, given the limitations that they face. And here I'll be very, very candid. The chief among those limitations is that from the very beginning, it's been clear to everyone here in the United States that we were not going to send soldiers to fight with Russia inside of Ukraine. I think President Biden understood that. He said so in nearly every speech that he's given. And I think there are good, solid reasons for that. Some of them are strategic, which we can talk about if you wish. But right now, the bottom line is that the American people in our Congress would never support it. Poll after poll has shown that. That said, there's also, I think, a strong bipartisan support for Ukraine in this fight. President Trump and some on the Republican right have made statements opposing it. But I think there's really strong support among traditional Republicans. Some of them, like Senator Lindsey Graham, who many in Georgia know, are critical that the administration has not done enough. I think many of you know that Congress isn't in session this week, but when they come back next week, I think you're going to see further legislative measures introduced to punish Russia and help Ukraine. Against this background, I think that there are key factors in the Biden administration approach. Am I coming through okay? I hear kind of an echo on my line here. Is it okay?
No, I think somebody needs to mute the computer, so it's we have somebody else's.
Can you hear me now? Okay, the echo is gone. All right. Let me just go back. I don't know how much I got cut off, but I was saying that there is, I think, still broad bipartisan support in the United States, in the Congress, and that it's both traditional Republicans and Democrats. Congress isn't in session this week, but they're going to come back next week, and I think you'll see further legislative measures introduced to punish Russia and to help Ukraine. So against that background, I'd say that there are 6 key factors in the Biden administration approach to the current crisis. First, they are not going to compromise on fundamentals. They're not going to give up on upholding the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine, nor on the position of keeping NATO's door open for future members. Second, the U.S. has provided substantial weapons and intelligence to Ukraine. That continues during the fighting. I'm not in government, so I can't comment in any detail about that. I know what you know by reading the newspapers. Third, the administration has worked very hard to build a common approach toward the crisis with our European allies. As you all know, this has been a fundamental goal of the Biden administration since it came to power over a year ago. But I think in the run-up to this crisis, they have put the crisis has really put the system of renewed transatlantic dialogue to the test. As we've all seen, they've done had very close consultations with our allies, both in terms of how we deal with the Russians and the negotiations that were launched and proved ineffective. And I think there's obviously been a very careful approach to trying to build a common, comprehensive list of sanctions, and we've seen that being rolled out over the last couple of days after the Russians launched their invasion. I think that you've also got another key factor here, which is the United States has continued to reinforce NATO, bringing troops from the States, but also moving troops that are in Germany and other places in Italy forward to the front lines to deter any kind of Russian desire to perhaps go beyond Ukraine with its military aggression. Fourth, I think the administration has tried hard to support and to keep open every negotiating channel so as not to lose any opportunity to find a negotiated diplomatic solution. We supported President Macron in his energetic efforts. And, I think you've heard President Biden even yesterday saying we're still open if they want to try to negotiate something. But I think for a long time, there's been a very deep sense here that President Putin had no real intention of moving forward in negotiation. But we can talk some further about that, and I'm sure Zurab will address the Russian situation quite well. It's also important, I think, to remember, and it seems now a long time ago, that back at the beginning of November, Bill Burns, our CIA director, was sent by President Biden to Moscow to warn the Russians, because we already had intelligence apparently at that point indicating the direction Putin was going, but also to try to engage them in discussions about trying to avoid this. I think sadly it now seems clear what many feared, that Putin had already made up his mind and that he was going to go to war with Ukraine and try to take Ukraine back by force. The fifth point I would make is that the administration has very aggressively declassified intelligence and publicized it to show the world what Russia had planned and to prevent, insofar as it was possible, to prevent Russia from carrying out these false flag operations, these excuses to justify their military invasion and seizure and attempt to seize Ukraine. It's really striking, and I was talking to some friends about this yesterday, to look back now and see how accurate the U.S. intelligence assessments that we know about have really been. My sixth and final point is that beyond just publicizing the intelligence, I think the administration has also effectively carried out a pretty effective information campaign to alert the world to Russia's plans, to rebut bluntly Russia's lies, and to maintain solid support among the allies and their populations. And I would add as a final point that the administration has done really, I think, a pretty exemplary job of explaining to the American people what's going on and what its approach has been, as well as trying to maintain this bipartisan support for our policy among the Congress and others. Just this week, every night on the evening news here in NBC, CBS, and ABC, Tony Blinken is on almost all of the channels every night doing an update both on what's happening, but also what the administration's policies are. So I think they've done that pretty much as well as they could possibly do it. So with that, Irakli, I will stop and be happy to answer questions after my colleagues make their presentations. Thank you.
Interesting remarks. Do we have any questions? I'm asking the administrator. Tantara megwaაქვს?
Mere.
Mere?
Albert.
არ ვიცი. Okay. Maybe later we'll get more questions. Okay. Next speaker at our webinar is Mr. Anders Wimbush, who is quite well known to Georgian part of the gathering. He is president of State Various Incorporated, a global consultancy focusing on strategy for public and private clients. He has served as a senior analyst at the RAND Corporation, Science Applications International Corporation, and Booz Allen Hamilton, a fellow at Hudson Institute and the German Marshall Fund. Mr. Wimbush been involved with Georgia since the mid-70s. I personally remember his very active steps here. With his colleague Mamuka Tsereteli, he founded the America-Georgia Business Council in 1998. In recent years, he has taught strategy seminars for Georgian diplomats and security planners. So he's not any sort of stranger here, but with his expertise, with his experience, of course, we would like to hear his review of the evolution of the post-Cold War relations between Russia and the collective West under the US leadership. And in light of this, why Russia decided to engage in this showdown now? Also, how substantiated are Russian ambitions to all the above said? Anders, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Irakli. It's wonderful to see you, old friend, and it's wonderful to be able to celebrate Levan's birthday, and all my best to Lali and the family. Let me first say how comprehensive and thorough I thought John Tefft's remarks were. I find myself largely in agreement with all of them. I think that he's given a very good characterization of how things are unfolding on this side of the Atlantic. I want to address my remarks to what this is going to mean to Georgia. I've been thinking about this forever, and Irakli, if you'll allow me to skip to your last question, which was how does this impact Georgia, this whole Ukraine business? I would very much like to do that, because I think that, to me, is the most interesting question. How should Georgia behave in this still unclear situation? The crisis in Ukraine certainly raises significant situational issues for Georgia, but it's hard for me to see that that's very much unclear for Georgians. especially after your experience of 2008 and being a close-by witness to the events of 2014 and now today's crisis. What Russia seeks to do must be crystal clear. Where a lack of clarity exists, from my perspective, is in the thinking of Georgian governments since Shevardnadze's about how to position and protect Georgia in and for the far-reaching geopolitical competition that surrounds it. Georgia's declared objectives are membership in Europe and NATO, and these are indeed desirable outcomes, and Georgia's efforts to achieve them have been honest and consistent. But both have only been distinct possibilities. Moreover, the combative nature of Georgia's internal politics, where each side accuses the other of being soft on Europe and NATO, has intensified, in my view. Georgia's singular focus on achieving membership in both as the most plausible and acceptable scenario for Georgia's future. Georgia's people want these things passionately, and again, that reinforces the wish. But wishes aren't strategy. And now the debate in the United States is going to endure even after this crisis has wound down, if it does, and even if there is still considerable bipartisan support for supporting the Ukrainian people. The question is going to be, is it wise to admit Ukraine or Georgia to NATO at the risk of conflict with Russia? It's in every paper. It's in every think tank. And even if Putin eventually sends his troops back to the barracks and his tanks back to their bases, this question is going to endure. My guess is that resistance to Georgia in NATO will prove to be more powerful to Georgia's prospects than the parallel complaint of allowing Russia's security preferences to determine NATO policy. In my view, Georgia before Ukraine was far from a full NATO membership. After Ukraine, however Ukraine turns out, it will be more distant still. Neither Germany nor France will allow Georgia to advance, even if the United States insists. Yes, there are certainly going to be a few American politicians who may insist on immediate membership for Georgia just to punish Putin with a sharp finger in his eye, but this is going to go nowhere. And has illuminated how brightly just how Georgia's putative champions on the right of American politics are evolving into advocates for Russia's security demands. Academics who once pretended to revel in the USSR's collapse and Georgia's independence are now producing voluminous op-eds and think tank pieces on why neither Ukraine nor Georgia should be, because doing so upsets the security balance with Russia. This isn't the same America as 1993, when Georgia had champions on both the left and the right of American politics. And recent polls from Pew, for example, suggest that even the majority of independent voters want the U.S. to stay out of the Ukraine controversy. Georgia's champions in this environment are going to become scarce. So I think, in my view, Georgia needs some strategic clarity, and I suggest 5 steps for getting it. First, Georgia must revisit or visit for the first time the notion of grand strategy. Grand strategy isn't just for grand powers, and it's especially valuable for struggling actors like Georgia. It begins by asking the most fundamental questions about Georgia's future. Where and what does Georgia wish to be 20 years from now? What is Georgia? What are its vital interests? And what capabilities does it possess, will it possess, to defend those vital interests? Second, the road to a successful grand strategy is how might we get there? Often has turns and forks. It seldom has one answer that by its very nature discourages consideration of other answers or combinations of answers. This is where Georgia needs to be more open and creative. Many possible answers exist to the how do we get there question. Getting there via NATO in Europe is only one of them. After Ukraine, which will likely close NATO's door to Georgia for a long time, Georgia's strategic planners can no longer allow their preoccupation with NATO and Europe to turn what should be a highly dynamic strategy building into something paralyzingly static. Wishing and hoping for the most desired outcome are not strategy. Third, successful strategizing for small countries almost always means layering protection as widely as possible. Georgia's aim, in my view, should be to create a security network of different layers where any Russian aggression against Georgia is calculated to offend the interests and security of other states. I've long argued for Georgia to become the center of the region's strategic discussion, to become deeply integrated with the Black Sea's other actors, with the Bucharest Nine, with the Three Seas advocates, with the Intermarium states and others, in the way that Georgia has successfully linked with Turkey and Azerbaijan. These kinds of security groupings are going to proliferate after Ukraine, when the most vulnerable states see the urgent necessity of more security layering, even if they're NATO members. The Baltic states' growing security relationship with non-NATO Sweden and Finland is a good example. Georgia needs to rethink its own strategic layering. Fourth, Georgia could also use its economic assets more strategically, for example, hydropower and seaports. Would Russia see Georgia as the same kind of tempting target if its aggression would harm substantial economic interests of, let's say, China, Japan, Turkey, the UK, or the United States? Maybe, but it would make Russia's decision more difficult, and it might even act as a strong deterrent. Fifth, yes, military cooperation with other states, especially with powerful states like the US and the UK and Turkey. Military cooperation is something that Georgia does very well, and with a NATO fixation. I anticipate in the aftermath of Ukraine that Georgia will have more opportunities to build military cooperation in a number of directions that are not fixated on NATO. Georgia should be open to these discussions. The Eurasian Security Order is now going to be reconsidered, rearranged, and for some reimagined in the wake of Ukraine, regardless of the outcome. Where is Georgia going to fit into this new world? Who will its friends and adversaries be? What does it bring to the table? Whose interests does it support? What contingencies will the opportunities and challenges of reshaping Eurasia's security create for Georgia? In other words, how should Georgia think about all of this? I doubt that Georgia can start again where it left off before Ukraine. My dear friend Levan Mikoladze was a strategist, and he was a good one, and he understood the art of grand strategy. If he were here, I'm confident he would be leading your thinkers and doing the necessary strategic calisthenics to find Georgia's place in a world that is about to emerge. And I think he would say, don't waste any time. Thank you. I'll stop there, Irakli.
Thanks to my and our friend Anders for his very, very interesting remarks. Definitely, we all have to take note all of them and think about more deeply, more profoundly, and more substantially. Thank you. Our next speaker is Ambassador Zurab Abashidze. He's special representative of Prime Minister of Georgia for relations with the Russian Federation. You all know that. At the various stages of his diplomatic career, he worked in India, Spain, Benelux countries. He was the first head of Georgia diplomatic mission to the EU and to NATO, as well as the ambassador of Russian Federation during 4 very, very, very tense years, 2000 and 2004. Mr. Abashidze is actively involved in an academic field. He's a professor at Tbilisi State University and author of numerous articles and publications, including the latest book, Cold War Journey into Today's Past. He's a really experienced and high qualified expert on Russian issues, on the mechanisms how the Russian politics works. And I'd like to ask him to present his views. What Russia is really trying to achieve by initiating the current standoff? Ukraine, is it end of all means? Also, how justified are Russian ambitions? And what is the real strength, weakness, opportunities, so-called SWOT analysis of Russian power? I understand this is a very, very, very comprehensive set of questions, but time is tense, situation is very, very important, and you are the only one probably who is able to cover this set entirely. So, Mr. Abashidze, please take the floor.
Well, as you perfectly remember, in July 1947, Foreign Affairs magazine published an article by George Kennan titled "The Sources of the Soviet Conduct." Kennan's assessments and conclusions to an important extent remain valid to today's Russia. But obviously there are new realities as well. So in my brief presentation, I will try to analyze these new realities of the modern Russia's conduct, which I will present from the Russians' point of view, not mine, of course. This crisis presented in the media as one between Russia and Ukraine. This is not, however, how it is seen in Moscow. By demonstrating its military capabilities and political resolve to intervene, Russia is seeking to replace the current European security order based on US dominance and NATO's central role with a new two-pillar architecture based on an agreement between Russia and the United States. The Ukraine crisis has demonstrated once again Russia's readiness to use military force to prevent further expansion of NATO into former Soviet territory. The first one was in Georgia, as you perfectly remember. In Russia's view, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the collective West started changing fundamentals of world order established after the World War II, adapting them to solely their interests. Russia was perceived as a loser. The Helsinki Act of 1990 for a united Europe without dividing lines from the Atlantic to Vladivostok has remained a list of good wishes. According to today's Russia's assessment and memory, in the 90s, Russia hoped and was willing to join Western institutions while maintaining its independence in matters of defense and security. By the end of this 20th century, it became clear that this was an impossible task. Therefore, a de facto world order arose based on the US dominance according to the winner-loser formula, according to Moscow. 15 years ago, after Vladimir Putin's speech at the Munich Security Conference in 2007, it was announced by Kremlin that the unipolar world order under the aegis of the United States has exhausted itself and Russia was back again. NATO and the European Union are constantly advocating for the principle of freedom to choose the ways to ensure security. In Russia's mind, it is not a universal principle. The West uses this principle according to its national and geostrategic interests. Moscow supports and reminds the West another important principle of undivided security, or no country should build its security at the expense of the other state. In Mr. Putin's mind, Ukraine should abandon NATO project and be a neutral state like Austria or Finland, as he declared. Nowadays, Ukraine and Georgia are regarded by Kremlin as puppet states of Washington Obkom. According to them, those are not truly independent countries. To understand the concerns according to the Russian leadership, it is useful to look at the history of the formation of the country's strategic vision. For 500 years, Russia has been subjected to constant invasions from the West, Polish, Swedish, French, and twice German. Each of them carried existential threats to sovereignty and independence. The historical track has formed both the military elite and society and increased sensitivity to such a concept as strategic depths. Any leader of Russia who does not take these circumstances into account will experience a lack of legitimacy. Today, the length of Baltic state borders with Russia is 860 kilometers. When they add to that possible NATO membership of Ukraine, the length reaches almost 3,000 kilometers. That's how Russian army headquarters make their calculations. Another important point which Russia considers to be a tool of Western world is a democratic or so-called color revolutions, like in Georgia in 2003, Ukraine in 2004 and 14, Kyrgyzstan 2005, 2010. Those revolutions are assessed as a rehearsal for the regime change in Russia, which targets personally Mr. Putin's grip to power. Western-funded NGOs are regarded and legally defined as foreign agents. Russian officials never miss the opportunity to mention the cases of Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and Syria as an example of intervention into internal affairs of sovereign countries and imposing alien values on others. The settlement of the situation in these countries after the operations of the US and allies are still heavily criticized by Moscow. In Russia's view, the US and its allies acted in those cases in gross violation of international law and the basics of UN. Recognition of Kosovo's independence triggered Russia's similar response in Georgia in 2008. Sanctions that followed Russia's assertive conduct inside and outside country are viewed as a tool to contain Russia, which is becoming stronger and stronger. In various occasions, we heard Mr. Putin saying that sanctions will be imposed on Russia in any case, whatever its conduct. That Russia has to be ready for the worst case scenarios. Sanctions are the main tool when Western leaders want to do something about Russia. But most of the penalties over the past decade have been economically minor and ineffective at changing Russian policy. This policy of limited sanctions so far was regarded as a sign of weakness. Moscow doesn't like the weak opponents, like the title of famous movie, Moscow does not believe in tears. And there is the main point. In Moscow's view, there can't be any formula of the European security architecture without taking into account Russia's interests. This perception is based on more than historical experience. In 19th century, Russia was founding member and a key figure of the so-called European concert, and the World War II produced a world order where Russia was one of the main pillars. The present big game by Russia is aimed at regaining that leading position. And concluding, I remind you that this was Russia's point of view and not mine, so don't be angry on me, please. Thank you.
A masterpiece of analysis of Russian mind as well as diplomacy. Thank you. And now we have another representative of the American think tank community, dear Mr. Mamuka Tsereteli, our close friend and ally for many years. Mamuka is a senior fellow at Central Asia Caucasus Institute at the American Foreign Policy Council, president of America-Georgia Business Council, and adjunct professor of at American University in Washington, D.C. He has more than 30 years experience in academia, diplomacy, and business development, focusing on security and economic business energy developments in the Black Sea, Caspian region, this vital region for us. I'd like to give him floor and I'd ask him to speak about what are the possible scenarios for the outcome of current confrontation. What do you think? How can they affect the security of the wider Black Sea region, particularly Georgia? So, Mamuka, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Batono Irakli. First of all, it's an honor for me to be part of this panel and this discussion, again, celebrating life of our dear friend Levan Mikheladze. I'm honored and proud to be his friend and his family's friend. And this is great tradition, which I hope will continue for as long as we all are around. So this is important gathering, an important topic for our discussion. I'll start with a simple, very simple statement that I see the need to reiterate because of some of the movements inside of Georgia that I observed in the last couple of years. So I would start with a statement that Russian state is an enemy of Georgian statehood. And I learned about that when I was very, very young, actually in my childhood, reading all Georgian classics of 19th or 20th century, including Ilya Chavchavadze, Mamuka Tsereteli, and others, and also reading Georgian history of last 250 years. So Russian state is the enemy of Georgian statehood. And this is important for us to, not in this audience, but in some audiences to remember. I want to reiterate also that some of the points that my good friend and somebody whom I consider to be my mentor, Mr. Wimbush, said about importance of, in a sense, diversification of strategic perspective of Georgia and looking in different directions for that. But before going there, I would like to make one important point. I think important point that we all remember President Putin's statement in the Munich conference in 2007. But unfortunately, sometimes we forget about some of the actions he was already conducting by then. And one important element of his strategy, actually, my point is that he already had vision and strategy about for the last 2 decades. And I don't think that we all understood that his pursuit of this strategy, or even essence of his strategy, or I don't think that we took him very seriously, and his threats very seriously. And a couple of points to demonstrate it. One is that he withdrew from the CFE Conventional Forces in Europe treaty in 2007, suspended it. In 2008, actually stopped Russia's participation. We know how hard Ambassador Levan Mikheladze and Irakli Menagarishvili and others worked to get this agreement in 1999 at Istanbul summit, and how much Georgia received from that agreement, including the withdrawal of Russian forces from Georgian territory by 2005. But by 2007, Russia stopped its participation in an agreement and really actually transformed the framework of collaboration between Russia and the rest of the Europe, Western Europe and Eastern Europe. And that, in a sense, went unnoticed. And one of the victims of that disappearance of this Helsinki framework that Soviet Union was signatory was obviously Georgia. Another serious threat he made was before and after recognition of Kosovo's independence. And again, I don't think that he was taken seriously. His threats were not taken seriously vis-a-vis Ukraine as well. And I don't think that we had a full understanding of his motivations or his actions or expectation of what he would do, President Putin. And when I say understanding his logic or motivation or actions, I'm not saying that or need for taking him seriously. It doesn't mean that we should somehow comply with his demands. Understanding and taking them seriously means preparing to address the worst threats he's making, to have diplomatic, economic, military security means in place and strategy in place to be ready for worst case scenario developments. Unfortunately, in my opinion, the West did not have these preparations in place, neither in 2008 nor 2014, or clearly we see it. We don't have it in 2002. So for too long, I think, Russia was no longer seen as a strategic adversary. And as a result, Russia, in a sense, is in the driver's seat and proactive, while West in general is a reactive and unclear of purpose and strategy. And that leaves countries like Moldova, it left actually countries like Moldova, Ukraine, and Georgia with no security guarantees, as we know. So, by the way, 2 years ago, I would probably include Azerbaijan in this list, but I'm no longer including Azerbaijan in this list because of the results of the war and preparation for the war in Karabakh. And this brings me now closer to Caucasus and Georgia. And Azerbaijan's success in the war in Karabakh showed that with great power consent, in this case, with consent of Russia and Turkey, smaller actors like Azerbaijan can achieve their national objectives with military means more efficiently than with diplomatic means. Cost of that military success of Azerbaijan still remains to be assessed going forward, but immediate national objectives of Azerbaijan were achieved in a successful way. And that sends a serious signal to other countries, and that's important, I think, to pay attention to. One of the possible scenarios of developments is that for Georgia, and I think we will see renewed pressure on Georgia on this 3+3 initiative, which is supported by Georgia's partners as well, like Turkey and Azerbaijan, and which leaves actually West out of the discussions or forums of Caucasus affairs. And it's for many in the Caucasus, it reminds a 100-year-old story when Russia, Soviet Russia, and Kemalist Turkey actually agreed to deal with Caucasus without any Western participation, and this is a reminiscent of that process. But I think Georgia needs to be ready for this type of pressure coming even from the partner countries, and this is important consideration, I think. But there's an interesting element in this initiative. Even Russian officials and as well as semi-official people and think tank community, they don't mention Abkhazia or Tkhinvali region in this as a political entities for this initiative. It's interesting to pay attention to that. Even Russians, in a sense, do not consider those territories as independent states. We all know that formally they recognize them as independent states. So in political geography of 3+3, there is no place for Abkhazia or Tkhinvali region. There may be different interpretations for that. Clearly, one is that they don't see them as states, but then another thing which may see, and I know it's a controversial theme in Georgia, but this is a signal to Georgia as well that if you settle with us, like Azerbaijan, and deal with us in these frameworks, you may have some chance for some territorial gains as well going forward. How much that promise worth and what is the value of that, I leave it to you to decide. We know history, and that was my statement from the beginning, what I learned from history of Georgia. I'm sure that we all agree that Georgia needs to consider all scenarios and have clarity in national security strategy, as mentioned, as Anders mentioned, and broader strategy for all those scenarios. Priority for security should remain, obviously, to be integrated with the strategic partner countries from Europe, United States, but also looking to other partnership, as Anders mentioned. I definitely share his view on that. But it is essential also to understand how the outside support, how far outside support can go, and to not exaggerate expectations while trying to extract as much as possible from the international partnerships. With the help of partners, Georgia should continue its focus on developing its territorial defense capabilities as other defense capabilities. As we know, in the Caucasus and in the broader region, weak actors are not respected. So Georgia needs to be strong militarily, despite the scenarios of development, potential scenarios of development. The focus on hard security needs to be complemented with meaningful cooperation on regional infrastructure development and Europe, Black Sea, Caspian connectivity. It is important for Georgia and Azerbaijan to achieve the same degree of understanding and collaboration on issues of general cargo transit and trade as they had and continue to have on the development of the energy transit infrastructure. I see great potential there, and totally share also the view that more actors are involved in trade and transit through Caucasus. That will give more security and at least some risk mitigation elements for Georgia's strategy involving many actors in this process. While this trade and transit will not solve hardcore security challenges of Georgia, it will help to improve the areas of country's strategic position in general, will reduce sources of internal, help to reduce sources of internal instability and bolster resilience in the face of external manipulation. So I would like to probably, obviously, it is paramount importance for Georgia to have internal stability and economic growth that will reduce opportunities for manipulation from outside actors, and mostly, obviously, for Russia. So I would probably stop here, and then based on questions maybe, and if we have time left, we can have some other comments going forward. Thank you.
Okay, Mamuka, thank you. As usually, your comments were very interesting, thought-provoking, as we call it. Now, it's my particular honor to welcome at our gathering Ambassador of the United States to Georgia, Honorable Kelly Degnan. Good evening, the Ambassador. We have reshuffled a bit our already discussed structure of discussion, but not the strategy and not the main issues. So yeah, you are again very much welcome, and it's my honor to give you floor to speak to this audience. You know the topic, you got the preparation material, so The ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to join today. I apologize for joining in a little bit late and missing some of the earlier commentary. I'm very interested, obviously, in hearing what this distinguished panel of experts has to say on this important issue. I have been in Washington for consultations this past week, and I can say that the Russia crisis is the top foreign policy priority for the United States right now, with a considerable amount of focus in every agency that I met with. Obviously, the situation is evolving quickly, and I encourage everyone to follow the White House and the State Department social media pages for the latest developments. Without the benefit of having heard the earlier discussions, I would just like to note that this war is unfortunately what the United States has been warning about. And despite the clear evidence before us for some time now, President Putin, Foreign Minister Lavrov, others in the Russian government flatly denied their intent to invade, calling the West, the United States, hysterical for even making these indications, and trying to flip it over to the West as being provocative by making these warnings. I think from all our efforts, it's clear the United States did not want war. We worked very hard with our allies and partners, engaging in nonstop diplomacy to avoid this and to improve the stability and security in Europe and coordinate our response in an effort to head off this war. Working through the UN, NATO, OSCE, and of course, very vigorously bilaterally. We've also been sharing information through various channels, coordinating our efforts and our decision making almost daily with our counterparts, including with Georgia. But as we see, our diplomatic efforts could not dissuade President Putin from proceeding with his aggression. As President Biden said yesterday, Putin is the aggressor here. He chose this war. And tragically, this is a war of choice that will lead to untold human suffering and economic consequences, as we are already seeing in Ukraine. Excuse me, I have a little bit of a cold. It's also increasingly clear that this war is not about NATO. This is a revanchist Russia intent on undermining the sovereignty of its neighbors in order to establish a privileged sphere of influence. This is a threat, obviously, to the entire region. And now, as we have said many times, it is critical to show a unified front, including in Georgia. And I hope that Georgians will put aside the deep partisan divisions that have paralyzed the country for the last few years and present a unified front in the face of this serious security challenge. This is obviously not a new problem, as Georgians know, and it's not a problem that Georgia has to face alone. In my consultations in Washington, it's very clear to me that Georgia was very much a part of the considerations and remains part of the considerations as decisions are made as we go forward. I would say there is a strategy. We are trying to game out an adversary who is leaving many options open. So our strategy has to be multifaceted in order to be able to respond to whatever the next move we see. But all along, trying to stave off a war that would bring serious suffering and hardship to many of the countries involved, including potentially Georgia, in terms of the economic impact, as well as the United States and Europe. We we're already seeing disinformation efforts using what's happening in Ukraine to call into question Georgia's commitment to the Western integration. We must push back against that hard and make sure that Russia does not get a veto over Georgia's choices or Ukraine's choices or any sovereign nation's choices. So I appreciate the chance to be here today. As this crisis unfolds, we'll continue to consult and work closely with the Georgian government, as we have been doing. I will be meeting with Georgian officials when I get back to Tbilisi. I'm leaving tonight. And we will continue to stand with Ukraine and with Georgia and continue to try and push back against whatever Putin has planned next. I would say in response to a comment that was just made, the United States has engaged Russia regularly and creatively, I would say, over the past 20 years. And we've received very mixed messages from Russia. It is not clear that this is the path Russia was on for the last 20 years. And I would say that if you look at the NATO-Russia Council and the NATO-Russia founding document and what opportunities that presented to Russia at the time and subsequent to 1997, I would say the amount of effort that the United States invested in the CFE negotiations after 2007, a considerable amount of time spent by Toria Nuland and others to try and salvage that important treaty after Russia withdrew. I would also say, look at the New START treaty negotiations that happened in 2011. These are all indications of an opportunity to change the dynamic with Russia. So over the last 20 years, we have had a lot of positive signals from Russia that did not indicate that this was where Russia was going. And maybe we missed other signals along the way, but I would say our effort has been consistent to try and establish a more positive rapport with this country, this important country in Europe. I also agree that regional cooperation for the Caucasus, the three Caucasus countries, is very important and could be a strategic strength for the region if the three countries can come together. I think there are many opportunities right now, more than in the recent past, and I know the three governments are working hard toward that. So I think we would all like to see that succeed for the benefit of the region, in spite of this war, but also because of this war. Thank you again for letting me join you this morning.
Irakli.
Sorry, Akhla?
Akhlaki.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, some technical misunderstanding. Thank you very much, the Ambassador, for your kind words. And we have discussed here the current situation from very angles, and you see these prominent representatives of American and Georgian diplomatic and intellectual circles. Yes, I agree fully that we have to work hard to come over this problematic period of our history. Again, many thanks. And now I have to give the floor to our main host, Mr. Archil Gegeshidze. Archil, yeah, you're here.
I'm here.
He is an experienced diplomat, analyst, and most of all, he's our host who has organized this today's discussion. So he's an important, very important person. Archil, floor is yours, and we would like to hear about your thoughts about the lessons we have to learn from these developments of late, and what do you think will follow?
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Madam Ambassador. Thank you for joining us and finding time despite your very busy schedule and very important visit to Washington. Thank you, everybody. And on behalf of our foundation, I would like to start with a big thank you for all of you to be part of this discussion, which is dedicated to our common good friend, late Ambassador Levan Mikheladze. And indeed, as Anders mentioned, if he would be alive, then Georgia would be better equipped with ideas, with policies, with strategies, and with the expertise to guide country and navigate country in these very challenging times and environment as Georgia finds itself. I would subscribe to everything which previous distinguished speakers said. Everything is something that I would say also if asked to comment on those issues. But I would like to complement the discussion by offering a few words about the current momentum, because a lot of been said about the future possible opportunities which Georgia and Ukraine, but Georgia in particular, could have after this crisis, or what should be the strategies and the fine-tuned policies of Georgia joining these multiple layered or multiple alliances in the region, how to strengthen its internal politics and moving forward, advancing in reform process of democratic institutions and other areas. But I think that the current momentum which we are witnessing these past 2 days, I mean this drama which takes place now in Ukraine, and as of this speaking, every minute could be decisive. It could be decisive not for the immediate future, but for more long-term future, because as I think everybody would agree, Putin's game is not about just subduing Ukraine and denying it or preventing it, Ukraine moving towards NATO. It has more far-reaching goals, and these goals have been already mentioned in this discussion, and this is about to revisit the existing security architecture in Europe, which has been in place over in the past 30 years. And Russia is not content with this security architecture. Russia wants to have a more vocal say in this architecture, and that's why Russia is protesting against the existing architecture by offering first in the form of the documents where the preferred, desired structure and composition of the future architecture is displayed, or otherwise use any means to achieve this goal. And one of the goals Russia chose lately was to punish Ukraine, and through punishing Ukraine, through subduing Ukraine, through preventing Ukraine from moving towards NATO, to persuade members of the Atlantic community to sit down and renegotiate this new architecture structure in Europe. And if so, then Putin seems to be playing a long game. This is not just Ukraine. Even if Ukraine falls tonight, then this would not be end of Putin's game. And I think that especially the collective West should be well prepared for the times to come after whatever takes place and happens in Ukraine in these days. Because again, Russia undoubtedly, I think, is too ambitious about having a very larger say in architecture, security architecture, on its own terms. Mamuka mentioned Putin's 2007 speech in Munich when he warned about already changed times and changed the de facto political weight of Russia in Europe. And in those times, nobody listened to those warnings, and Russia did what it did in Georgia in 2008. But Russia got away. Russia did not pay any price for that. And Russia easily opted for creating a larger scale crisis in Europe by annexing Crimea and instigating conflict in eastern Ukraine. And just 2 days ago, I was listening on BBC. Dan Fried was commenting on the current situation, and he said that I regret that in 2014 the sanctions that we imposed on Russia were not sufficient. We managed to kind of push back, but we failed to pull out, and we should have imposed stronger sanctions so that Russia would not dare to do what it does these days now in front of whole world. So my point here is that the response of the collective West under the U.S. leadership should be strategic. What we are seeing, we are seeing a combination of the different varieties of economic, financial sanctions. Yes, they are biting. They would be they're not very pleasant for Russians, but historically sanctions come and go, and Russia knows that one fine day these sanctions may disappear. But we need to respond to Russia more strategically, and the strategic response is to impose on Russia irreversible sanctions. And during these discussions, distinguished panelists here said that Georgia may get opportunity to be invited to Western-led institutions, being that NATO or European Union, after this crisis. But this hope is based on the assumption that Russia will fail in Ukraine. But who knows? Odds are 50-50. Nobody knows what may happen tonight. If Ukraine fails and Russia wins, then Russia will have an upper hand in future negotiations. And the revision of the current existing security architecture will be under Russia's prompts and Russia's guidelines. So that said, I think that the response, whatever we are seeing these days, is not strategic. And we've been hearing all the day, every hour, Zelensky speaks to the audience, to the public, and in all his appearances during the day is that please, he applies to international community, please help us. We are one-on-one with Russia, and whether or not the sanctions imposed yesterday has an impact on Russia, we are seeing that in the skies, where we see the Russian aircraft, and on the land when we see Russian tanks. That said that it means that they don't work. So we need more active support. And he meant in this particular case military support, because whatever Ukraine received in January, February, it was very good for the first day to push back a little bit to Russia, but to sustain this resistance, apparently Ukraine needs more supplies of lethal weaponry, which is not happening, if judging on Zelensky's statements. So what I'm saying is that we should not exclude that Ukraine may fail to resist Russia. More so, we are hearing the latest news before we started the discussion was that Russians agreed to negotiate with Ukraine in Minsk, because it was these negotiations was initiated by Zelensky yesterday, and today Russians agreed. And in those negotiations in Minsk, if these negotiations take place tomorrow, let's say, then Russia will have an upper hand, and the topic of these negotiations would be Ukraine's capitulation, and forcing Ukraine to give up NATO aspirations and European Union's membership aspirations. And if so, the next target will be Georgia, because we will be the only post-Soviet, CIS, former CIS or post-Soviet countries apart from Baltics, who has this NATO and European Union, joining European Union ambitions. And so the next target will be us. And are we prepared for that? Are we Georgians, but also our partners in the world, are we prepared for that? I doubt. So it is really a critical moment, and we have to think about how to save this moment, if still there is a time for that. But for in the longer term, we have to think about even in case of failure of Ukraine, what should be the policies of the collective West should be in response to Russia in this longer term game. And here I see some challenges, because yes, the West has become lately more consolidated and more united, but there is no consensus on some of the very crucial issues within this collective West. For example, switching off from SWIFT, Russia. We know that 4 countries, European countries, they are against of this. But if SWIFT as an element of the economic sanctions would been imposed on Russia, it could. I'm not 100% sure, but it could change some of Russia's tactical moves these days. So there is a moment of truth for everyone. It's a moment of truth for Ukraine, of course. It's a moment of truth for the collective West. It's a moment of truth for Russia as well. And the stakes are very high. And whoever have learned previous lessons better, and whoever is more proactive and more quick in its decisions and moves, it will have an upper hand in this very crucial momentum. So I would not like to somehow be very much alarming, but I think that we have to be more realistic about vulnerability of all of us against Russia's 19th century instruments, which it deploys to achieve its goals. And only our unity, only our consolidation, only only maintenance of this consolidation in the longer term will really result in weakening Russia, first its economy, and otherwise Russia can be stopped and deterred. So this would be my final comment, and I'm ready to answer questions if we have any time for that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Archil. I fully agree with you that all these developments are challenging to us Georgians very much, and we have to learn lessons from all these developments. Many thanks. And now about the questions, I ask administration to show us what we have. Okay, so one question to whom is addressed. If we come back to the war in Ukraine, what is the aim of Russia? It is just a demonstration of power. Does it plan to further expand its invasion in Europe? There is no distinct address. So I would ask the panelists if anybody of you is prepared to give the answers to answer this question.
Perhaps I could start, and I'm sure Zurab and others may have some thoughts.
Okay.
I think Putin's fundamental goal here is to get Ukraine back under Russian control.
Mm-hmm.
I've been going back over my own notes, back even to before the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, and he's always had a very special focus on Ukraine. You'll all remember back in 2004 and 5, he went twice to Ukraine to campaign with Yanukovych for the presidency. And I think you can actually look and trace basically a series of failures on the part of the Russian government since then to try to get what they want, which is control over Ukrainian territory and Ukrainian politics. I look at this as something of a revanchist kind of post-imperial process. I don't think it's going to succeed in the long term, although the suffering that it's causing and will probably cause for some time is just very, very appreciable. And it's just so sad and it's tragic. I've been trying to follow as best I can what's been going on in Moscow itself. And I have been struck by how surprised so many of the people who are kind of foreign policy specialists were by this kind of massive invasion. There seemed to be, at least the stuff I've seen, and I defer to Zurab and others here who follow it very closely. You're closer to it than I am. But it seems that so many Russians convinced themselves, and I think even our friends at the foreign ministry convinced themselves that this was all going to be an attempt to try to intimidate the Ukrainian government, to take back perhaps all of the Donbass, but an attempt to kind of take down the whole process, which seems to be what they're trying to do now, surprise people. There was a piece yesterday that I read here by a translation of a Russian analyst who said that the very few people around Putin knew what he really intended here. Even the foreign ministry guys, and as we were saying before the broadcast began, even many of the members of the Security Council, when they had the meeting on Monday, didn't seem to know what exactly Putin was trying to do. So, I think deep down, people have described his speech on Monday as very emotional and angry. And I think you can, if you look back and try to piece it all together, you can understand where he's coming from. That doesn't make it obviously good at all. But I think there's also, at least from what I can tell, some growing opposition. Obviously, it's a very repressive society, so I don't expect huge changes. But I think there's a lot of people who are unhappy with this, not just among the elites, but also I think a lot of ordinary Russians. I think back to my time in Moscow, ordinary Russians who have friends and family in Ukraine who are saying to themselves, what are we doing fighting against our Ukrainian brothers? And you can the propaganda against the West is one thing, but there's kind of fundamental questions here that I suspect this this military invasion will raise. So anyway, just some thoughts. I defer to Zurab and others who follow this and Archil who follow this very closely. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, really. Zurab, would you like to add some thoughts?
Well, there is very little that I can add to Ambassador Tefft's words. Yes, I agree that the first aim for Russia is the number one is to regain Ukraine into its sphere of influence. Of course, Ukraine is of the utmost importance for Russia, and to get back other countries of its traditional, as they call it, influence, like South Caucasus, Central Asia, and
Baltic states, by the way, also.
Baltic states, maybe in future, yes. Another aim is to stop NATO expansion, which is clearly defined as a double red line. They like to mention this point that it is not only a red line, but it's a double red line. It is not about only stopping NATO's expansion, but it's about a reverse of certain expansion by NATO and going back to 1997 in terms of taking out from certain countries of Eastern Europe like Romania, Poland, and Baltic republics of some military infrastructure which was installed there.
Out of them, yeah.
Yes, during last 10 years or so. And the wiser design, the bigger design is for something that I spoke about. This is reshaping European security design and making it more dependent on Russia on the basis of common interests, mainly agreed between Russia and the United States, and on the other hand, with the European traditional, classical, let's say, European countries. So Russia wants its interests to be taken into account into this new design of the European security structure, which may really be a new reality after developments in Ukraine. We have to see how it ends and what is the next development after let's say the certain development is concluded in Ukraine, and we will have more clear picture where we are. But so I think those are the main points, main goals of Russia, which is clearly and openly declared. Nothing is hidden, nothing is secret. They make no secret out of it. Well, unfortunately, we are back into not into 19th century, but back into the middle centuries, where there was no international law. International law is over practically, and one who has the bigger gun and one which is
bigger stick
more than an arm, then it can dictate its terms to the weaker countries. This is the new reality, absolutely.
We are back to pre-Westphalian peace times.
Yeah, previous.
But on Irakli, if I may comment very briefly about
please.
what I think he is trying to do in general, what his plans are. I think you remember Zbigniew Brzezinski's book, published in 1997, Grand Chessboard. He quotes in that book great geographer and founder of geopolitics, Clifford Mackinder. And Mackinder, talks about whoever controls Eastern Europe controls the Central Island, whoever controls Central Island controls the entire world. And I think it is important to understand that Brzezinski's, that point is very highly publicized among Russian thinkers. And they think what West is trying to do by controlling Ukraine is to control Russia and entire Eurasia. And whether West thinks that way or not, they think that West thinks in those terms. And that pushes him to some extremes. In my opinion, he made strategic mistake by pushing Yanukovych not to sign association agreement in 93, which really caused the Maidan and everything else then. And he's taking to this issue to the next extreme by doing whatever he's doing today. But I think we should think about his mentality and how he deals with that particular issue and subject of who controls the Eastern Europe, controls actually Russia, and that's his thinking in that. And Dugin and other thinkers are really directing his thinking to that direction.
Thank you, Mamuka. By the way, I agree fully with this thinking. Any other thoughts or comments? No, thank you. Other question? Yes.
I just spoke my. I mean, I just offered you my comments, but if I may, I could add a few words on this issue. So I try to say that Russia's grand strategy, if we can say so, is to demolish the existing system of European security that the West, as Russia thinks, out of
just
greed.
European? You think?
Say again?
Just European?
Euro-Atlantic security architecture. Yeah.
Global. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And which was put in place 30 years ago at the time of Russia's weakness and illusions. So this system, as Russians think, is counterproductive and dangerous for everyone, for Russia first and foremost. So it has to be demolished and a new one built. So this is an overall goal, to my understanding. The specific objectives is to reconsolidate power or rebuild, as President Biden said, a Soviet Union on the post-Soviet space as a necessary precondition for implementing that grand strategy. Another supporting objective is to protect post-Soviet space from the penetration of the hostile influence of the West, being that EU or NATO, and prevent Ukraine and Georgia entering these institutions. And more specific these days, the more specific objective is to change regime, to achieve regime change in Ukraine, and also to try to change Ukraine's foreign policy orientation. That's why I think Russians agreed on negotiations in Minsk, if this news is true, tomorrow. So these are the two levels of objectives: grand strategy objective and specific objectives. But as I said, Putin is engaged in a longer term game, and as Baton Irakli tried to correct me about just the European security architecture. Of course, Russia thinks globally. Russia thinks that times have changed, and we are moving towards a multipolar world. And there is a rising competitor on the horizon, China. And according to the official documents of the United States, the primary competitor from Washington is seen China, Russia as well, but first and foremost China. so that to secure a dignified place and role in the future global order on par with the United States and China, first, Russia wants now to settle this course with the West. That's why this showdown was initiated by Russia. And on a tactical level, Russia has an advantage, and it's very close to win this war. And then, from the position of the stronger negotiator, sit down on the table and renegotiate this new security architecture and future world order.
Current world order.
Yeah, this is a kind of vision of a missionary, and Putin claims to be a missionary. He does not see himself to be an ordinary politician. He's a missionary, a savior, and having that far-reaching, maybe overly ambitious, but very costly for everyone. This vision and policies. That's how I see Russia's ambitions.
Thank you. Have we any other comments? If not, I'd ask administrator to show us if there is another question. Okay. Next will be Georgia. Agree with Archil. What to do? Question. Who is prepared to comment on this question? All we are doing here this evening is trying to find questions, answer on these questions. But now let's formulate the final, I would say, concluding formula.
I think Anders' entire presentation was answer to that question, in my view. So.
Yeah.
Anders, you want to talk about that?
I agree, by the way. Anders, would you like to say some words?
I would say a couple of things. First, it seems to me that what we are witnessing now in Ukraine should come as a surprise to no one. And all of you have given evidence of the concerns that have dated back well over a decade and a half, maybe 2 decades, by the Russian elite, certainly by Mr. Putin, of what he expects to do. So, will Georgia be next? Very likely. I think that if you follow his way of thinking about things, and if you also accept that Georgia itself has not done enough to cover its security bases effectively because of this, as I mentioned earlier, because of this preoccupation with NATO and Europe, which drowns everything else out. If you take those two things together, you have both a motive that we already know about, you have an opportunity which has been allowed to develop. The question is, what are you going to do in the future? What comes next? And I tried to, at the end of my remarks, that the time for putting strategies in place that are layered, that bring in, as Mamuka said, more actors. I love this phrase, strategic diversification, the perspective of strategy diversified. That has to happen. Georgia can't go back to where it was 4 days ago in light of what's going on in Ukraine and think that everything that it's done and everything that it hopes will happen is now going to take place. It's going to have to start over, and it has to rethink its position very, very carefully. This is not easy to do, but if we want Georgia not to be next, we're going to have to think of a series of possible contingencies that could affect Georgia, how we get into them, and how we would remedy them if they were to occur. but we haven't done any of that, or we've done very little of it. Georgia, to me, as I mentioned in my earlier remarks, was always the logical place for the broader, more diversified security and strategy discussion for its region. I mean, its region in a larger sense, for the South Caucasus, for Turkey, for Central Asia, for the Black Sea, from the Caspian to the Black Sea. Georgia is where these discussions should be taking place. Georgia touches all of the issues that are going to be coming on the table. Many of them have been on the table for a long time, but more and more will now show just how vital these new conditions are because of Ukraine. So Georgia needs to work its way intellectually, strategically through its position. It has to game out scenarios. If this were to happen, these are the kinds of responses that we might have at our disposal. As strategists would say, you have to develop some strategies. You can't invest your entire worldview on a single point. But I fear that Georgia has, and not entirely, but it has been so preoccupied by telling its Europe and NATO's story that it has lost track of opportunities that exist to give it greater security and protection through other kinds of layering.
Okay. Thank you, Anders. Thank you very much.
May
Mr.
I?
Abashidze is showing his
Well, again, not
comment, please.
yes, not much to add to the question. Will Georgia be next?
Yeah.
Well, I don't think that Georgia will be next necessarily in terms of military operation to be conducted against this country.
Yes, we experienced it already.
Yeah, we experienced it already, and second, there is no reason why should Russia conduct military operation. But again, nobody knows what is in mind of Mr. Putin, including his close surroundings. Anything may happen. But on another hand, if NATO perspective is closed to Ukraine, then unfortunately Georgia will be next. This is my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Anything else?
Irakli, if I may, unfortunately I have some engagement that I need to attend, which is the class that I need to participate and teach. So I would like to apologize and say thank you to all the participants and to Levan Mikeladze Foundation for organizing this. And my apologies again, and hope to see you all. And maybe we'll have a follow-up conversation with this group and maybe some other speakers as well. So thank you, and my apologies.
Thank you, Mamuka. Please, all participants, accept my apologies for catastrophically failing to deal with the timeline of our time plan of our meeting. But yes, we have exceeded the, I would say, plan we had previously more than half an hour. If there are no other questions, I will ask administrator, do we have anything else or not? No more question? Yeah. All agree that economic sanctions are long-time measures. What West may do now? People are dying now in Ukraine. Are they Are there any other ways to stop Russia?
I think this was already discussed.
Yeah, the nuclear question. Any
The answer
comment?
is no.
I don't think that we have any alternative to those steps already undertaken by our Western friends, because it's about them to think and act with regard to the problem. Post-Soviet countries are too weak to think of how to punish Russia, how to sanction Russia. I think this is the only we can comment on this question. Anything else? Not. Okay. If not, I again, please accept my apologies for the unrealistically, I would say, composed structure of the discussion, and for the wasting some time
Due to technical problems.
yeah, for technical and some other issues. But anyway, I think this webinar and this discussion in its entirety, as well as the fact that is dedicated to the Mr. Levan Mikeladze's memory, make today I'd say important, and what we have learned today, I think, will be helpful to us while strategizing on the current developments and East-West relationship. Many thanks to all of you. I'm so much appreciate to the each of your input, and I hope that we will continue having each other in touch, and looking forward to have you at other events of the Levan Mikeladze Foundation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And in just 2 words, let me, on behalf of Levan Mikeladze Foundation, once again, thank you all for your contribution to this discussion. Thank you to everybody for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Archil.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Anders.
Thanks, everybody.